Hi, good morning, Apers. I just wanted to send something out to you that I think will be on the test that we didn't get a chance to talk about. Take a look at this diagram right here. This is a measurement of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This was started just before 1960. They started taking measurements of atmospheric CO2 to keep record over time of what the concentrations were in the atmosphere. Obviously, the first thing we notice is that there is a increase over time, obviously from 1958-ish, 1957 to our current time. Obviously, that follows the trend that we talked about all year long due to fossil fuel usage and all industry and all those other things, with our burning of coal and all of those things that we've talked about this year. There's a couple things I want to talk about, though. If you see where the measurements are being taken. So it's Mauna Loa, Hawaii. They decided to do the research in this area because it is out over the open ocean. They decided to take measurements here because it did not have a lot of influences from cars and industry and power generation. They wanted to get a very accurate measurement of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so this is why they took those measurements out over the ocean, out off the shores of Hawaii. So that's one thing that they might ask you about. Why did they take measurements here? It's because there was not a lot of human influences. They could get an accurate measurement of atmospheric CO2. The other thing you're going to see here is that it's a jagged line. If you follow the red line, those are the actual measurements of CO2. There is a reason for this, and I wanted to make sure you guys understand what that reason is, because that's the other thing that they usually ask you about. If you look in the lower corner here, you can see this annual cycle. There is an uptick. From January to about May or so, and then it starts to drop off. We need to understand why that's the case. Remember that there is a larger amount of landmass in the northern hemisphere. Well, what do you have on landmass? You have plants. You have trees that are coming out of hibernation. You have the growing season of plants that starts happening in May, and so those CO2 levels start to drop. And because they start to drop, it's because those plants are going through photosynthesis. Well, photosynthesis, remember, takes water, sunlight, and the important component here, CO2. So during the northern hemisphere summer, you see a continuing drop in CO2 levels. Then you reach fall in the northern hemisphere, and what happens in fall? Our trees go dormant, our growing season is done, crops are being harvested, and as those things start to drop off their photosynthetic rates, as in like they're not going through photosynthesis as much, the CO2 levels in the atmosphere start to go back up. So that is why you see this jagged line all the way up to our current period, is because you have this annual cycle. So don't forget, the CO2 levels are going to build starting in our fall, going all the way into our spring, and once our growing season starts, those photosynthetic rates start to increase, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere until through our summer and into our fall, where they go dormant again, and then the CO2 starts to rise. So those are things that I wanted to talk about. One, the reason why they are doing it off the shores of Hawaii, because there's little human influence. They can get an accurate measurement of CO2 levels. Two, we are seeing a continued rise in CO2 levels, so we've talked about that all year, and then the annual cycle where, because of the northern hemisphere during its summer months, spring and summer months, there's more landmass and more plants growing and higher rates of photosynthesis, pulling atmospheric CO2 out of the atmosphere, and that's why you see a drop starting in the spring, going into our summer through the growing season, and once we hit fall and plants go dormant, those CO2 levels start to rise because there is nothing pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. I mean, think about our fall and our winter. Our trees are dormant, and you have snow on the ground, so we are just building CO2 because the cars and industry and power generation that's releasing CO2, there's nothing pulling it out of the atmosphere, so that's why it's allowed to build up. So that is the quick nitty and gritty on this diagram that I wanted you guys to see. Hopefully this helps you. Please watch this, or hope you watch this, 4.5 minutes, and we're good. Done.